a WikiVidi documentaries production. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Enjoy. The Beatles. The Beatles were an English rock band formed in Liverpool in 1960. With members John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison and Ringo Starr, they became widely regarded as the foremost and most influential music band in history. Rooted in skiffle, beat and 1950s rock and roll, the Beatles later experimented with several musical styles, ranging from pop ballads and Indian music to psychedelia and hard rock, often incorporating classical elements and unconventional recording techniques in innovative ways. In 1963, their enormous popularity first emerged as Beatlemania, as the group's music grew in sophistication. Led by primary songwriters Lennon and McCartney, the band were integral to pop music's evolution into an art form and to the development of the counterculture of the 1960s. The Beatles built their reputation playing clubs in Liverpool and Hamburg over a 3-year period from 1960, with Stuart Sutcliffe initially serving as bass player. The core trio of Lennon, McCartney and Harrison, together since 1958, went through a succession of drummers, including Pete Best, before asking Starr to join them in 1962. Manager Brian Epstein molded them into a professional act, and producer George Martin guided and developed their recordings, greatly expanding the group's popularity in the United Kingdom after their first hit, Love Me Do, in late 1962. They acquired the nickname, the Fab Four, as Beatlemania grew in Britain over the next year, and by early 1964 became international stars, leading the British invasion of the United States pop market. From 1965 onwards, the Beatles produced increasingly innovative recordings, including the albums Rubber Soul, Revolver, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, The Beatles, and Abbey Road. After their breakup in 1970, they each enjoyed success as solo artists. Lennon was shot and killed in December 1980, and Harrison died of lung cancer in November 2001. McCartney and Starr remain musically active. The Beatles are the best-selling band in history, with estimated sales of over 800 million physical and digital albums worldwide. They have had more #1 albums on the British charts and sold more singles in the UK than any other act. They are also the best-selling music artists in the United States, with 178 million certified units. In 2008, the group topped Billboard magazine's list of the all-time most successful artists. They hold the record for most #1 hits on the Hot 100 chart with 20. They have received 7 Grammy Awards, an Academy Award for Best Original Song Score and 15 Ivor Novello Awards. The group was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1988, and all 4 main members were inducted individually from 1994 to 2015. They were also collectively included in Time magazine's compilation of the 20th century's 100 most influential people. 1957, 1962, Formation, Hamburg, and UK popularity. In March 1957, John Lennon, then aged 16, formed a skiffle group with several friends from Quarry Bank High School. They briefly called themselves the Blackjacks, before changing their name to the Quarrymen after discovering that a respected local group was already using the other name. 15-year-old Paul McCartney joined as a rhythm guitarist shortly after he and Lennon met that July. In February 1958, McCartney invited his friend George Harrison to watch the band. The 15-year-old auditioned for Lennon, impressing him with his playing. But Lennon initially thought Harrison was too young to join them. After a month of Harrison's persistence, during a second meeting arranged by McCartney, he performed the lead guitar part for the instrumental, Raunchy, on the upper deck of a Liverpool bus, and they enlisted him as their lead guitarist. By January 1959, Lennon's Quarry Bank friends had left the group, and he began studies at the Liverpool College of Art. The 3 guitarists, billing themselves at least 3 times as Johnny and the Moondogs, were playing rock and roll whenever they could find a drummer. Lennon's art school friend Stuart Sutcliffe, who had recently sold one of his paintings and was persuaded to purchase a bass guitar, joined in January 1960, and it was he who suggested changing the band's name to Beatles. As a tribute to Buddy Holly and the Crickets, they used the name until May, when they became the Silver Beatles, before undertaking a brief tour of Scotland as the backing group for pop singer and fellow Liverpudlian Johnny Gentle. By early July, they had changed their name to the Silver Beatles, and by the middle of August to the Beatles. Alan Williams, the Beatles' unofficial manager, arranged a residency for them in Hamburg. But lacking a full-time drummer, they auditioned and hired Pete Best in mid-August 1960. The band, now a five-piece, left 4 days later, contracted to club owner Bruno Koschmider for what would be a 3.5-month residency. Beatles historian Mark Lewison writes, "They pulled into Hamburg at dusk on the 17th of August, the time when the red light area comes to life. Flashing neon lights screamed out the various entertainment on offer, while scantily clad women sat unabashed in shop windows waiting for business opportunities." Koschmider had converted a couple of strip clubs in the district into music venues, and he initially placed the Beatles at the Indra Club. After closing the Indra due to noise complaints, he moved them to the K Circular in October, when he learned they had been performing at the rival Top 10 club in breach of their contract. He gave the band 1 month's termination notice, and reported the underage Harrison, who had obtained permission to stay in Hamburg by lying to the German authorities about his age. The authorities arranged for Harrison's deportation in late November. 1 week later, Koschmider had McCartney and Best arrested for arson after they set fire to a condom in a concrete corridor. The authorities deported them. Lennon returned to Liverpool in early December, while Sutcliffe remained in Hamburg until late February with his German fiancée Astrid Kirchherr, who took the first semi-professional photos of the Beatles. During the next 2 years, the Beatles were resident for periods in Hamburg, where they used Prelude in both recreationally and to maintain their energy through all-night performances. In 1961, during their second Hamburg engagement, Kirchherr cut Sutcliffe's hair in the "Exy" style, later adopted by the other Beatles. When Sutcliffe decided to leave the band early that year and resume his art studies in Germany, McCartney took up the bass. Producer Bert Kempfert contracted what was now a 4-piece group until June 1962, and he used them as Tony Sheridan's backing band on a series of recordings for Polydor Records. As part of the sessions, the Beatles were signed to Polydor for 1 year. Credited to Tony Sheridan and the Beat Brothers, the single, My Bonnie, recorded in June 1961 and released 4 months later, reached number 32 on the Music Mark chart. After the Beatles completed their second Hamburg residency, they enjoyed increasing popularity in Liverpool with the growing Mersey beat movement. However, they were also growing tired of the monotony of numerous appearances at the same clubs night after night. In November 1961, during one of the group's frequent performances at the Cavern Club, they encountered Brian Epstein, a local record store owner and music columnist. He later recalled, "I immediately liked what I heard. They were fresh, and they were honest, and they had what I thought was a sort of presence. A star quality." Epstein courted the band over the next couple of months, and they appointed him as their manager in January 1962. Throughout early and mid-1962, Epstein sought to free the Beatles from their contractual obligations to Bert Kempfert Productions. He eventually negotiated a 1-month early release from their contract in exchange for one last recording session in Hamburg. Tragedy greeted them on their return to Germany in April, when a distraught Kirchherr met them at the airport with news of Sutcliffe's death the previous day from what would later be determined to have been a brain hemorrhage. Epstein began negotiations with record labels for a recording contract. In order to secure a UK record contract, Epstein negotiated an early end to the band's contract with Polydor, in exchange for more recordings backing Tony Sheridan. After a New Year's Day audition, Decca Records rejected the band with the comment, "Guitar groups are on the way out, Mr. Epstein." However, 3 months later, producer George Martin signed the Beatles to ME's Parlophone label. Martin's first recording session with the Beatles took place at ME's Abbey Road Studios in London on the 6th of June 1962. Martin immediately complained to Epstein about Best's poor drumming and suggested they use a session drummer in his place. Already contemplating Best's dismissal, the Beatles replaced him in mid-August with Ringo Starr, who left Rory Storm and the Hurricanes to join them. A 4 September session at EMI yielded a recording of Love Me Do, featuring Starr on drums. But a dissatisfied Martin hired drummer Andy White for the band's third session a week later, which produced recordings of Love Me Do, Please Please Me, and P.S. I Love You. Martin initially selected the Starr version of Love Me Do for the band's first single, though subsequent repressings featured the White version, with Starr on tambourine. Released in early October, Love Me Do peaked at number 17 on the record retailer chart. Their television debut came later that month with a live performance on the regional news program People and Places. After Martin suggested re-recording Please Please Me at a faster tempo, a studio session in late November yielded that recording, of which Martin accurately predicted, "You've just made your first number one." In December 1962, the Beatles concluded their fifth and final Hamburg residency. By 1963, they had agreed that all four band members would contribute vocals to their albums, including Starr. Despite his restricted vocal range, to validate his standing in the group, Lennon and McCartney had established a songwriting partnership, and as the band's success grew, their dominant collaboration limited Harrison's opportunities as a lead vocalist. Epstein, in an effort to maximize the Beatles' commercial potential, encouraged them to adopt a professional approach to performing. Lennon recalled him saying, "Look, if you really want to get in these bigger places, you're going to have to change. Stop eating on stage, stop swearing, stop smoking." Lennon said, "We used to dress how we liked, on and off stage. He'd tell us that jeans were not particularly smart and could we possibly manage to wear proper trousers, but he didn't want us suddenly looking square. He'd let us have our own sense of individuality." Please Please Me and with the Beatles. On the 11th of February 1963, the Beatles recorded 10 songs during a single studio session for their debut LP, Please Please Me. The album was supplemented by the 4 tracks already released on their first 2 singles. Martin originally considered recording the Beatles' debut LP Live at the Cavern Club, but after deciding that the building's acoustics were inadequate, he elected to simulate a live album with minimal production in a single marathon session at Abbey Road. After the moderate success of Love Me Do, the single, Please Please Me, met with a more emphatic reception. Released in January 1963, 2 months ahead of the album of the same name, the song reached number 1 on every chart in London except Record Retailer, where it peaked at number 2. Recalling how the Beatles rushed to deliver a debut album, bashing out Please Please Me in a day, AllMusic's Stephen Thomas Earlywine comments, "Decades after its release, the album still sounds fresh, precisely because of its intense origins." Lennon said little thought went into composition at the time. He and McCartney were just writing songs a la Everly Brothers, a la Buddy Holly, pop songs with no more thought of them than that to create a sound, and the words were almost irrelevant. Released in March 1963, the album initiated a run during which 11 of their 12 studio albums released in the United Kingdom through 1970 reached number 1. The band's third single, From Me to You, came out in April and was also a chart-topping hit, starting an almost unbroken string of 17 British number 1 singles for the Beatles, including all but one of the 18 they released over the next 6 years. Issued in August, the band's fourth single, She Loves You, achieved the fastest sales of any record in the UK up to that time, selling 750,000 copies in under 4 weeks. It became their first single to sell 1 million copies, and remained the biggest-selling record in the UK until 1978. Their commercial success brought increased media exposure, to which the Beatles responded with an irreverent and comical attitude that defied the expectations of pop musicians at the time, inspiring even more interest. The band toured the UK 3 times in the first half of the year, a 4-week tour that began in February. The Beatles' first nationwide, preceded 3-week tours in March and May-June. As their popularity spread, a frenzied adulation of the group took hold. Greeted with riotous enthusiasm by screaming fans, the press dubbed the phenomenon Beatlemania, although not billed as tour leaders. The Beatles overshadowed American acts Tommy Roe and Chris Montez during the February engagements and assumed top billing, by audience demand. Something no British act had previously accomplished while touring with artists from the US. A similar situation arose during their May-June tour with Roy Orbison. In late October, the Beatles began a 5-day tour of Sweden, their first time abroad since the final Hamburg engagement of December 1962. On their return to the UK on the 31st of October, several hundred screaming fans greeted them in heavy rain at Heathrow Airport. Around 50 to 100 journalists and photographers as well as representatives from the BBC also joined the airport reception, the first of more than 100 such events. The next day, the band began its 4th tour of Britain within 9 months, this once scheduled for 6 weeks. In mid-November, as Beatlemania intensified, police resorted to using high-pressure water hoses to control the crowd before a concert in Plymouth. Please Please Me maintained the top position on the record retailer chart for 30 weeks, only to be displaced by its follow-up, With the Beatles, which EMI released on the 22nd of November to record advance orders of 270,000 copies. The LP topped 500,000 albums sold in 1 week. Recorded between July and October, With the Beatles made better use of studio production techniques than its predecessor. It held the top spot for 21 weeks with a chart life of 40 weeks. Early Wine described the LP as a sequel of the highest order, one that betters the original. In a reversal of then standard practice, EMI released the album ahead of the impending single, I Want to Hold Your Hand, with the song excluded to maximize the single's sales. The album caught the attention of music critic William Mann of The Times, who suggested that Lennon and McCartney were the outstanding English composers of 1963. The newspaper published a series of articles in which Mann offered detailed analyses of the music, lending it respectability. With the Beatles became the second album in UK chart history to sell 1 million copies, a figure previously reached only by the 1958 South Pacific soundtrack. When writing the sleeve notes for the album, the band's press officer, Tony Barrow, used the superlative the fabulous foursome, which the media widely adopted as the Fab Four. First visit to United States and British invasion. EMI's American subsidiary, Capitol Records, hindered the Beatles' releases in the United States for more than a year by initially declining to issue their music, including their first 3 singles. Concurrent negotiations with the independent US label VJ led to the release of some of the songs in 1963, but not all. VJ finished preparation for the album introducing the Beatles, culled from most of the songs of Parlophone's Please Please Me, but a management shake-up led to the album not being released. Then when it surfaced that the label did not report royalties on their sales, the license VJ signed with EMI was voided. A new license was granted to the Swan label for the single, She Loves You. The record received some airplay in the Tidewater area of Virginia by Gene Loving of radio station WGH and was featured on the Rate a Record segment of American Bandstand, but it failed to catch on nationally. Epstein arranged for a $40,000 US marketing campaign. American chart success began after disc jockey Carol James of AM radio station WWDC in Washington, D.C. first played I Want to Hold Your Hand in mid-December 1963. It was not until the end of the first week of January 1964 that their records were played in New York City, and then the rest of the country, initiating their music's spread across US radio. This caused an increase in demand, leading Capitol to rush release I Want to Hold Your Hand later that month. Issued on the 26th of December 1963, with the band's previously scheduled debut there just weeks away. I Want to Hold Your Hand sold 1 million copies, becoming a #1 hit in the US by mid-January. In its wake, VJ released Introducing the Beatles to go along with Capitol's debut album, Meet the Beatles, while Swan reactivated production of She Loves You. On the 7th of February 1964, the Beatles left the United Kingdom with an estimated 4,000 fans gathered at Heathrow, waving and screaming as the aircraft took off. Upon landing at New York's John F. Kennedy Airport, an uproarious crowd estimated at 3,000 greeted them. They gave their first live U.S. television performance 2 days later on The Ed Sullivan Show. watched by approximately 73 million viewers in over 23 million households, or 34% of the American population. Biographer Jonathan Gould writes that, according to the Nielsen rating service, it was the largest audience that had ever been recorded for an American television. The next morning, the Beatles awoke to a largely negative critical consensus in the US, but a day later at their first US concert, Beatlemania erupted at the Washington Coliseum. Back in New York the following day, the Beatles met with another strong reception during 2 shows at Carnegie Hall. The band flew to Florida, where they appeared on the weekly Ed Sullivan Show a second time, before another 70 million viewers, before returning to the UK on the 22nd of February. The Beatles' first visit to the United States took place when the nation was still mourning the assassination of President John F. Kennedy the previous November. For many, particularly the young, their performances reignited the sense of excitement and possibility that momentarily faded in the wake of the assassination. Some commentators suggest that the Beatles helped make way for the revolutionary social changes to come in the decade. According to Michael Gilmore, their hairstyle, unusually long for the era and mocked by many adults, became an emblem of rebellion to the burgeoning youth culture. The Beatles' popularity generated unprecedented interest in British music, and a number of other UK acts subsequently made their own American debuts, successfully touring over the next 3 years in what was termed the British Invasion. The Beatles' success in the US opened the door for a successive string of British beat groups and pop acts such as the Dave Clark Five, the Animals, Petula Clark, the Kinks, and the Rolling Stones to achieve success in America. During the week of the 4th of April 1964, the Beatles held 12 positions on the Billboard Hot 100 singles chart, including the top 5. Brought to you by WikiVidi Documentaries. Would you like to know more?